Part 1. The Jungle's Invisible Assassins. Throughout the 1960s, more than 58,000 American soldiers perished in Vietnam. But behind that figure lies an even more devastating truth. For every 10 soldiers who marched into the deep jungle, 7 were struck down not by stray bullets, but by the invisible assassins of the tropics. By 1967, liberation forces had transformed the very soil of Vietnam into a lethal weapons platform. Using discarded soda cans and even human waste, they engineered a psychological hell where every step was a gamble with a 50% chance of failure. Does it make you wonder about the crushing pressure on a soldier, knowing that metal detectors could pick up a mere 4 out of 100 traps? Today, I will take you deep into the raw reality of these pitfalls and tunnel systems, elements that prove sophisticated technology is worthless if you do not truly master the ground beneath your feet. At the height of the conflict's intensity, American infantrymen in Vietnam endured a bitter, haunting realization this land was not merely a geographical battlefield. It was a biological predator collecting its due through lost man days and total psychological exhaustion. Deep within the jagged, mist-heavy peaks of the Ia, Drang Cai, a soldier's survival was often decided not by his marksmanship or the quality of his rifle, but by his ability to endure a ruthless assault from nature that began the moment he stepped off a Huey helicopter. The story of a Marine and the parasites invading his body is not just a rare medical report. It was the beginning of a systematic dismantling of the human frame in the tropics. Entering the monsoon season of 1968, the U.S. High Command realized they were not simply fighting a human insurgency. They were attempting to occupy a Triple-Canopy nightmare, acting as a biological fortress. The Vietnamese jungle was not just a forest with thick vegetation, but a vertically integrated ecosystem designed to swallow anything that dared cross its threshold. At the highest level, the emergent layer scattered ancient trees reaching heights of 250 feet, monopolized the direct sunlight, leaving the world below in a state of permanent isolation. Beneath them was the main canopy, an unbroken ceiling of interlaced branches nearly 20 feet thick, completely masking the sky. For a soldier on the ground, this meant only 2% of sunlight reached the forest floor. This was a critical issue, as it turned a tropical afternoon into literal darkness, where reading a map at high noon required a flashlight. Visibility often dropped below 15 feet, allowing the enemy to remain completely invisible even at point-blank range. This oppressive stifling created a paradoxical isolation. A soldier could be surrounded by his entire platoon, hearing their breathing in the mud, yet remain utterly alone in every way. The very trees that offered cover acted as physical barriers to salvation. Smoke grenades, the primary method for signaling rescue helicopters, frequently became trapped under the 20-foot thick ceiling, hiding the unit's position from pilots circling blindly above. The foliage was so dense and the trunks so massive that Huey helicopters often could not find a landing zone. Even steel rescue hoists, lowered from winches, would snag and tangle in rotting branches before reaching the ground. The radio, a lifeline weighing nearly 11 pounds, often became a useless box of static in this humid atmosphere. Then there were the vines American GIs hauntingly called wait-a-minute vines, actually tangled thickets of rattan and thorns. These were more than obstacles. They were barbed wires that latched onto rucksacks and sleeves, shredding uniforms, and literally grinding down a soldier's physical stamina. In 90% humidity, these men weren't just sweating, they were struggling to breathe in air as thick as water. Every meter forward was a brutal negotiation with the terrain that neutralized the American military machine before the first engagement even began. Part 2. The body as a battlefield. By late 1968, a terrifying statistical reality emerged from field medical reports. The United States military was being systematically dismantled by an enemy that carried no gun. While the public focused on combat casualties, a staggering 69% of all U.S. hospital admissions in Vietnam were due to disease. These were not matters of minor aches or common fevers. These were debilitating admissions that drained beds, doctors, and long-term recovery time. In fact, gunshot wounds or shrapnel accounted for only 1/6 of hospitalizations. The jungle was 4 times more likely to put a soldier in the hospital than enemy fire. Malaria topped the list of these invisible killers, with over 40,000 recorded cases in the army. As early as 1965, malaria alone caused hospitalizations on par with combat wounds. The military attempted to counter this with weekly pills. However, on the Vietnamese battlefield, the local strain of Plasmodium falciparum had evolved to be completely resistant to these drugs. This turned the weekly pills issued to GIS into decorations. The soldiers took them religiously, yet the parasites ravaged their bodies regardless. This biological onslaught fell disproportionately on the light infantrymen, the grunts, who made up only 15% of the total force but bore nearly 60% of the malaria cases. Beyond the fevers, the land itself attacked from the bottom up. In the Mekong Delta, soldiers spent 48 hours or more with their feet submerged in stagnant paddy water. This led to immersion foot, or paddy foot, a condition where the flesh was destroyed, blistered, and began to literally rot off the bone. One military surgeon noted that this condition often caused more lost combat time than all other medical causes combined in affected units. Even more haunting was the long-term debt the jungle collected. Decades after the war, veterans discovered they had been carrying liver flukes, parasites known as Opisthochis vivarini, inside their bile ducts for 25 years before they silently triggered cancer. It planted a biological time bomb inside him and waited a generation to collect the debt. Ask yourself, how would it feel to know that the true enemy killing you wasn't the soldier on the other side of the line, but the swallow of water you just drank, or the very boots you wore every day? Part 3. The deadly ingenuity of booby traps. By 1969, as the conflict entered a grueling transition phase, American infantrymen found that the very ground beneath them had been systematically converted into a lethal weapon. This was no longer merely a war of high-tech ballistics. It had evolved into a psychological hell constructed from bamboo, human waste, and even America's own discarded industrial trash. The liberation forces demonstrated a terrifying level of survivalist creativity. Look at the Punji traps of the early 70s. Bamboo stakes, sharpened fire-hardened for durability, and smeared with organic matter to ensure deep infection and necrosis. They were hidden in camouflaged pits, with stakes angled downward so that when a soldier's foot fell in, the act of pulling it out only drove the bamboo deeper into the tissue. Although these traps accounted for only about 2% of non-fatal casualties, their true mission was to completely erode the psyche of every man in the platoon. Every step during a 12-month tour became a high-stakes gamble with permanent disability. This prolonged instability affected the human mind in ways no sniper bullet could. But the ingenuity of the resistance did not stop at nature. By this stage, the United States had dropped approximately 7.6 million tons of ordnance, inadvertently providing a nearly inexhaustible source of raw materials for enemy weapon makers. Discarded soda cans and C-ration tins were frequently repurposed as casings for tripwire grenades. Even a spent .50 caliber shell casing was turned into a toe popper, a minimalist mine made from salvaged gunpowder, triggered by a simple nail. The result was a horrific wound created at zero cost. Perhaps the most bitter irony was the widespread use of bouncing Betty mines. Originally, U.S. manufactured weapons, they were recovered by guerrillas from American minefields and turned back against the soldiers who had built them. Look at this figure, 51.3%. That was the percentage of traps detected only when they exploded. This meant that for half of the soldiers, the first warning of the enemy's existence was the last sound they would ever hear. Part 4. Underground Nightmares and Toxic Legacies. The confrontation did not end at the jungle canopy. It transformed into a suffocating nightmare deep within the geology itself. The Coochie Tunnel system expanded into a subterranean labyrinth stretching over 250 kilometers, boring through 3 distinct geological levels. These passages housed hospitals, smokeless kitchens, and command centers with capacities for thousands right beneath the feet of American military bases. To combat this invisible city, the tunnel rats were formed small-statured men armed only with a flashlight and a .45 pistol, crawling into the darkness where venomous snakes, scorpions, and liberation fighters lay in wait. The casualty rate for these volunteers reached 33%, a testament to the horror of subterranean close-quarters combat. In a desperate bid to strip the enemy of their environmental advantage, the United States launched Operation Ranch Hand, spraying approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides like Agent Orange over 12% of South Vietnam. The goal was to destroy the jungle, but the war weaponized the very act of destruction. The dioxin contained in the poison did more than kill trees. In the bodies of American soldiers and silently poisoned millions of civilians through contaminated soil and water. Decades later, the jungle has regrown and the tunnels have become tourist attractions. But the liver flukes and dioxin remnants still linger in the blood of those who remained like an endless biological debt. When the last helicopters lifted off the embassy roof in 1975, the ceasefire on paper was a mere illusion. The Vietnamese jungle signed no treaty. It simply receded to begin its silent phase of debt collection. Today, the forest has regrown to cover the bomb craters, but its biological legacy remains deeply rooted in the DNA of an entire generation. We face a haunting hypothesis. Perhaps the true victor was not an ideology, but the environment itself, the thing that successfully resisted and permanently altered anyone who tried to conquer it. Looking back at this entire picture, one realizes a grim truth in this confrontation with harsh nature. The distinction of victory or defeat on a military map fades before the suffering endured by both sides. War, in the end, is a game where the price paid always outweighs any political gain. The American soldier left with nightmares of rustling leaves and a body harboring pathogens for a lifetime. Meanwhile, the children of Vietnam must continue to live on a strip of land where every sip of water and handful of soil may contain the toxic legacy of dioxin. Both sides, whether conqueror or defender, were ultimately caught in a vortex of biological destruction. Nature favors no one. It quietly records the trauma upon the bodies and souls of all who enter its shadows. The futility of war lies precisely there. When the gun smoke clears, what remains is not glory, but a generation sharing unhealed scars, reminding us that in a war against the planet itself, humanity will never have a true winner. Our journey through the green hell ends here. In the next episode, we will travel to 1984 to investigate the Bhopal gas tragedy, a night when an industrial giant turned an entire city into a silent grave in mere hours. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the truth behind the most horrific chemical disaster in human history.